Good evening, comrades. Welcome to a special session in our series. This is not so much Lives of the Left, but a session to discuss some aspects of Tony Greenstein's book. He's written a book, as comrades know, on Zionism during the Holocaust. Today he wants to look at the relationship between the Israeli regime and the Argentina junta, which was not during the Holocaust, but it has, of course, it relates to it. So thank you very much, Tony, for joining us, especially in your poor health, and fire away. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Yes, I'm sorry if I'm not absolutely 100% today, but I will give it my best. I mean, Israel, which is an apartheid state, is a far worse state compared to South African apartheid. I saw the South African veterans of the anti-apartheid fight have attested, is nonetheless in receipt of the kind of support politically in the West that South Africa never receives. And the question is why that is so. And I think one of the most enduring myths about what is called the Jewish state is simply that if ever anti-Semites come to power, if ever anti-Semitism again becomes a major factor in a country's politics, Jews will have somewhere to turn to, unlike during the Holocaust. Because whatever the Zionists did during the Holocaust, that can be excused on the grounds that, well, they didn't have a state anyway. They had no power. Whereas today, of course, there is no such excuse. However, I'm going to demonstrate that this is not the case, that it has always been the case that Zionism never set up a Jewish state in order to save Jews. That is as true now as it was 100 years ago. And the example that I'm going to give is Argentina, because Argentina, between 1976 and 1983, was really the first post-war neo-Nazi state, the first post-war state with a neo-Nazi regime to come to power. I'm leaving aside General Stroessner in Paraguay, which is a special case. It was really a backwater in South America. It was extremely far right, but I'm not aware of any particular persecution of Jews there. But in Argentina, a series of generals led by General Videla, who became the first president, came to power in 1976. I don't have time to give the background to it. I'm sure you're able to reference it for yourself. And they had, amongst other things, their own conspiracy theory. It was called the Andina Plan. You won't have heard of it, but if you Google it, you will find reference to it. And it wasn't like the protocols of the Elders of Zion with the Elders of Zion sitting together. This was based on three Jewish figures, Marx, Freud, and Einstein, all of whom, of course, were dead by then. But that didn't stop the Andina Plan being circulated amongst the military and being believed by the far right. And this, if you like, was the glue that held them together. So you had a neo-Nazi junta. Now you would have thought that Israel would have been the first country to protest strongly at what happened. Let me give you, just to read out really, Zionist attitude to Zionism historically. And it was laid down by Theodor Herzl when he wrote in 1896, during the Dreyfus affair in Paris. He wrote in his diaries, page 6 of them, I think it is, "In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the futility of combating it." I say that was a Zionist attitude, that anti-Semitism was ingrained in the Gentile, in the non-Jew. It had been inherited for 2,000 years, and it was pointless trying to combat it. Not only that, but they understood the reasons for anti-Semitism. It was the Jews, because the Jews didn't have a national home of their own. They were kind of guests who had outstayed their welcome in other people's hotels. So, I mean, that was a Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism. And the question is, what happens in Argentina fits in with that very well in terms of what happened to the Jews, because under the Argentinian junta, something like 30,000 left-wingers, socialists, communists, etc., were, quote, disappeared. They died in the torture chambers, thrown out of helicopters into the sea, and so on. And Argentinian Jews made up to about 13% of the victims, despite the fact that the 250,000 Argentinian Jewish community did not make up even 1% of the Argentinian population. And if I quote, and I should say all of these quotes are in chapter 18, the final chapter of my book. So it's easy to reference, and all the footnotes are there. So I won't go through that now, because that will simply break up the talk. But after the junta basically collapsed, was overthrown, the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzan, who, if you remember, also investigated General Pinochet, who nonetheless New Labour decided would not be extradited. A 196-page report was presented to him in Madrid on the sufferings of Argentinian Jewry during the dictatorship. It revealed that at least 2 international Jewish organizations requested support from the governments of Brazil and the United States in case an evacuation of the entire Jewish community proved necessary. And the main figure who, if you like, epitomized what happened was the editor of that opinion, which was a liberal paper. I mean, it was edited by Jacobo Timmerman, a left Zionist. He was no radical or revolutionary, but nonetheless, as his obituary and the New York Times recounts, early on April 15th, 1977, 20 armed men broke into Timmerman's house. He was held in 3 clandestine houses of confinement and 2 regular prisons for more than a year, during which he was beaten, given electric shocks to his genitals, put in solitary confinement under humiliating circumstances, and interrogated endlessly. Well, you would imagine that Israel would have protested vehemently about this, because we all know that the Zionist organizations, whether in Britain or in Israel or elsewhere, are very alert to any signs of anti-Semitism. You only need to misspeak and say Jew instead of Zionist, and they will be down on you like a ton of bricks, you know? But it's quite amazing. There was absolutely no protest at all whatsoever. And again, a quote which is in my book: Israel's official policy can be described as an effort to show the junta that it had committed a serious error in arresting the journalist, but to avoid rousing international public opinion against the regime, and even more importantly, to avoid attributing anti-Semitic proclivities to the leadership of the dictatorship. Just digest those words. Here you have a neo-Nazi junta wedded to an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, busily torturing and arresting Jews. And the Israeli state's position was to avoid attributing anti-Semitic proclivities to the leaders of the dictatorship. So according to the front page headline of 3 Zionist papers in this country, Jeremy Corbyn posed an existential threat to the Jewish community. And the majority of the Jewish community, apparently 85%, accepted this, which might say something about the stupidity of the majority of the Jewish community in this country. But that's quite amazing. When it came to Argentina, where there was a neo-Nazi junta, absolutely nothing, silence. But if you contrast this to the Soviet Jewry campaign, I don't know whether any of you remember the Soviet Jewry campaign, but during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there was a massive Cold War campaign to, quote, free Soviet Jews from their imprisonment, as it were, in the Soviet Union. The Zionists demanded their right to emigrate, although a qualification, as long as it was to Israel. In fact, the Zionists and the Israeli government campaigned vehemently to prevent them going to anywhere else, and which was exactly the same, of course, with the Jewish refugees under the Nazis. Menachem Begin made a special flight to see Ronald Reagan to demand that American immigration barriers be raised to stop Jews who he said weren't genuine refugees, because of course they had Israel to get as a place to go to, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed in. Not only that, but they campaigned to stop Jewish welfare agencies, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, and others, not to aid them unless they were going to Israel. I don't have time to go into all of this, but the question is really why there was a massive campaign about the plight of Soviet Jewry, none of whom were being tortured to death. I'm not saying they didn't suffer harassment, but their lives were not endangered. Yet when it came to Argentina, where there was a large Jewish community, which incidentally was not Zionist, Zionists were a distinct minority in that community, Israel treated what was happening to them with relative indifference. And I quote in my book from Jacobo Timmerman. He wrote a book, a thin book, but it's very well worth reading, Prisoner Without a Cell, Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number. So, and you should be able to easily get it online. Timmerman, when he was in Israel, because he was expelled from Argentina in 1979 at a moment's notice, the Argentinian Supreme Court had twice ruled that he should be released, and in the end he was released into house imprisonment, as it were, house custody, and then a flight took him to Israel. And indeed, there were worries that the Argentinians might have him kidnapped on the way and bumped off. When Timmerman arrived, and he asked Israel Ger Aryeh, the Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, why the contrast between the treatment of Soviet Jews and Argentinian Jews? And his reply was quite stark. He said, very simple, the Soviet Union was in the enemy camp and Argentina was a strategic ally. And Timmerman commented, he wondered if that was why Argentina could torture prisoners because they were Jews. In other words, that they almost had a license to do so from the Israeli state. And people should think about that. Israel, if you like, was part of the anti-communist alliance, the Condor League, I think it was called, in Latin America during the 70s and 80s, which was set up basically to defeat radical and revolutionary movements. It was an alliance of the most viciously right-wing regimes, and Israel supported them with military equipment, arms sales, and so on. Indeed, in Argentina, when the Congress cut off arms supplies because of their appalling record, despite Ronald Reagan trying to veto it, who stepped into the breach? The Israeli state, of course. the Jewish state, as it calls itself. And Yeshayahu Anug, Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, wrote, "I would not say that Timmerman is crucial for us, but rather we are crucial for his release. It is not an emotional issue, but one of cool judgment. The formula consists in creating the sense that his release is vital for Argentina's image, and also for Israel, and the positive development of our relations with them." That's by Ryan and Davidi in an article, Exile of the World, or in a book rather, Exile of the Word. The perception was that the Jewish state's concern for the disappeared was subordinated to political and commercial considerations. And Marcel Zohar, he was a correspondent with the Yediot Ahronot. It's the largest circulation paid newspaper in Israel. And he wrote a book, Let My People Go to Hell. Unfortunately, it's in Hebrew and I need to get it translated, but I can quote from extracts which have been translated into English. He reported that Israel preferred friendship with Argentina over saving Jews. And that was the reality. And that, I understand, is what his book is about. So I have the transcripts, and at some stage I will get them translated. And some of you may remember Israel Shahak. He was a professor of organic chemistry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was a noted Israeli human rights activist, an anti-Zionist, not a Marxist, a liberal, but he was also a Holocaust survivor. He'd been a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and then Bergen-Belsen. He wrote, quote, "In the face of this well-known anti-Semitism in Argentina, the state of Israel, the Jewish state, the defender of the Jews, made not a single protest." You would imagine, surely, that the Knesset, the fount of Israeli democracy, the beacon of light and darkness, would have debated this matter at length. And indeed, attempts were made, repeated attempts by certain members of the Knesset, not just of the left, Shulamit Aloni and Yossi Sarid of Meretz, but also Gula Cohen, who was of the far right, but who in terms of anti-Semitism was genuine in a sense. But the speaker, Menachem Savador, absolutely refused. And later, when he stepped down, he revealed that he'd been pressurized by the Israeli government not to have a debate in the Knesset. And it was only in 1983, 6 months before the junta fell, after the defeat in the Falklands and so on, it was a walking corpse in a sense, that the Knesset held the debate after the Supreme Court had ruled that such a debate could not be prevented. And Shulamit Aloni, she is one of the founders of Meretz and the founder of RATS, the Civil Rights Party, which is one of the components of Meretz, a left Zionist party that has now disappeared from the Knesset altogether, said, quote, "Not only did they shut me up, but the late Knesset member Yigal Horowitz threatened me personally and ordered me not to open my mouth. She was told the subject could not just be debated, despite the fact that the parents of children who had disappeared came asking members to make representations." Yossi Sarid, who was one of the most prominent members of Meretz, during that debate, which was finally allowed, said that it was, quote, "a hypocritical discussion, since all the facts have long been known, and the government of Israel never once lifted a finger and cooperated with the Argentine murders because of their interest in arms sales." And he went on to say how in Argentina, Israel sold even the Jews for the price of its immediate interests. In 1985, in 1985, President Raul Alfonsin of Argentina, that's after the junta had fallen, cut off military contact with Israel entirely. But I think the point really to understand is that what Israel did during the period of the junta, when it was a strong power, it was rich, etc., was really no different from the behavior of the Zionist movement during the Holocaust. But it didn't have the excuse that it didn't have the power, it didn't have the resources, it didn't have an independent state. The fact is that a Jewish state will operate in the same way as any far-right state. I mean, to put it bluntly, any regime which is on the far right, any regime which is anti-Semitic, is a regime which will be supported by American imperialism. And I think we're seeing that in Ukraine today. And therefore, Israel will be in alliance with that regime, regardless of the position of the Jews within that. And that is exactly what happened in Argentina. And I quote from an article by Yitzhak Mualem, again, it's in my book, where he says, while the Jewish factor has an effect on Israeli policy, that is, Jews outside Israel, it is not a decisive one, nor the main one taken into account in the policy calculations of the Israeli government. The heritage of David Ben-Gurion, who was the first Israeli prime minister and the second longest serving one, determined that, quote, in our relations with foreign countries, we should be guided by one criteria, and that is whether it is good for the Jews being the Jewish state, the collective Jew. Because, as he also said, the state constitutes the highest goal of Zionism and the Jewish people, whose mere existence serves the needs of the diaspora. Now, you might ask yourself, and if you don't, I'll ask it for you, what was the position of the Jewish Chronicle during all of this? I mean, I think you'll remember during the Corbyn era, there was no more voluble critic of anti-Semitism than Steve Pollard, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Dozens of articles. Corbyn was an existential threat. Every time he lifted his hand, it was called anti-Semitic. David Baddiel called him out for mispronouncing, well, actually he didn't mispronounce, the name of Jeffrey Epstein as Epstein. That in itself was an anti-Semitic gesture. Where are all these people during the Argentinian junta? Well, the Jewish Chronicle wasn't entirely silent. It had a correspondent in Buenos Aires called Yosem Smilj. But unfortunately, he was an apologist for the junta and the leadership, the collaborationist leadership, which Timmerman called a Judenrat, like the Jewish councils under Nazi Germany. That was his description, not mine. Smilj alleged it was Timmerman's fight for human rights which was inspiring a rash of anti-Semitic articles in the Argentine press. He also alleged that that opinion, his paper, had supported the left wing of the Peronist Party. I mean, that was actually untrue. It hadn't, but when you're a Zionist, the truth really doesn't matter. It's a matter of convenience at best. In Israel, Ma'ariv, which is the evening newspaper, withdrew from agreeing to publish Timmerman's book, A Prisoner Without a Name, because it was, quote, not interesting and would not sell. In fact, it became an international bestseller. Timmerman in the United States, he was attacked by right-wing Zionists. Some of them openly said that he asked for what he got. US neoconservatives argued that junta enjoyed a good relationship with Israel which was an important supplier of arms and military equipment to Argentina, which is true. But they then went on to say, well, that was proof of the fact that the regime couldn't be anti-Semitic. So, I mean, this is the old story. If you're anti-Semitic and support Israel, then you're not an anti-Semite. Donald Trump, for example, Steve Bannon, Viktor Orban, for that matter. And the Israeli ambassador, Ram Nirgad, visited Timmerman when he'd been released under house arrest to ask him to sign a piece of paper saying he'd been well treated, which Timmerman absolutely refused to do. And he also met Yigal Aron, who was the former deputy prime minister of Israel, Labour Zionist. And Timmerman told him that he had not been humiliated by the torture, but by the silent complicity of Jewish leaders, not just, of course, in Israel, but in Argentina itself. There were two organizations, DIA, a Jewish confederation, which covered the whole of Argentina, and AMIA, the Jewish representative organization of Buenos Aires, where the vast majority of Argentinian Jews lived. And they were silent. They said nothing. They protested nothing. On the contrary, they actually took steps to actually whitewash the regime's reputation. And in one case that I've documented, they urged people not, the Israeli state, not to raise the issue of the regime and its treatment of Jews. I'll give you an example. When Timmerman was released to Israel, he received the Golden Pen of Freedom Award. I mean, normally Israel is very proud of any international award that its citizens get. But in this case, the venue was shifted from the Knesset to the Hebrew University in order not to offend the junta. But Timmerman really did not remain a Zionist very long. He wrote a book, The Longest War, attacking the Lebanese invasion of 1982 and what happened during it. The Deputy Foreign Minister, Yehuda Ben-Meir, described his book as a collection of calumnies and lies arising from his own self-hatred. And so when he died on the 11th of November 1999, he'd returned to Argentina by this time. After the fall of the junta, he decided Israel was not a very congenial place. He received glowing obituaries internationally, but Israeli papers provided only terse reports of his death. In 1988, I mean, the issue of the Jewish disappeared was a major issue. There were up to 3,000 Jews who were murdered, although you would never know from the Zionist propaganda. In 1988, Dr. Marcus Weinstein set up the Association of Families of Desperados. I'm not very good at speaking Spanish, or Judios, for Jews who had disappeared. It was a committee for the disappeared Jews in Israel. And they issued a statement. They were deeply disappointed by the fact the Israeli state and the international Jewish organizations, of which you can list numerous ones, like the Board of Deputies and the Jewish leadership in Argentina, are taking no interest in this subject. Weinstein told how Israel's indifference to the matter began during the days of the dictatorship and has continued to this day. Marcus Weinstein's son was the only Israeli citizen to be murdered by the junta. Marcel Zohar, who I've quoted before, the Idiot Achronot correspondent, described how Israel's government refrained from processing immigration applications from left-wing Jews. The unwritten instruction was to refuse any help to Jews defined as too left-wing, quote unquote. And who did the defining? The junta. In 2002, under pressure, the Israeli government set up a committee to investigate the disappearance of Jews. Weinstein recalled how we, and I quote here, we and other Jewish families knocked again and again on the door of the embassy, and we were always sent away. Was this a policy that was dictated from Israel? Was it a policy that was decided upon at the embassy? I did not find even a single word about this in the report. As I mentioned before, Dyer even tried to improve the image of the junta abroad, particularly in the USA. Shockingly, this is a quote, prominent sections of the Jewish community even pressurized Israeli representatives not to interfere in Argentina's internal affairs. And after the fall of the junta, AMIA held its 90th anniversary celebrations. And I quote from a report in the Jewish Chronicle. A group of women whose children disappeared during the Argentine military regime's crackdown on left-wing opponents shouted "Nazi, Nazi" at those attending the Congress here of AMIA. The guest of honor was Mr. Yitzhak Navon, formerly president of Israel. The mothers attempted to prevent his entrance to the conference as well as that of the Israeli ambassador to Argentina. For those of you who have any familiarity with what happened in Argentina, slowly the mothers of the disappeared, including a Jewish section, formed, and they would stage, despite extreme harassment, they would stage weekly protests in the center of Buenos Aires in a particular square to protest the disappearance of their children. And this helped the international campaign of solidarity and support of those who had been disappeared, i.e. murdered and tortured. I mean, Zohar Nirgad's successor, Nirgad being the ambassador, was Dov Shemorak. And he recalled how the junta's interior minister, General Albano Hargindage, congratulated him on how well he had done, quote, not to allow the main leaders of the Jewish community in Argentina to intervene on his, Timmerman's, behalf. So, I mean, this is Israeli collaboration at its extreme, and there can be no justification at all whatsoever. But after the junta fell, Timmerman's son, Hector, became the foreign minister of Argentina. This was in the 1990s. And Israel raised the 1994 bombing of the AMIA Center, and I want to come onto that briefly, and the alleged connection with Iran, because Israel had alleged that Iran and Hezbollah had bombed the Jewish Community Center in 1994, killing some 100 people and injuring well over that. Timmerman told Israel's ambassador, Israel has no right to ask for explanations. Israel does not speak for the Jewish people. Jews who live in Argentina are Argentinian citizens. The attack was against Argentina, and Israel's desire to be involved in the matter only gives ammunition to anti-Semites who accuse Jews of dual loyalty. And I want to come on now really to the bombing of the Jewish Community Center, which was on the 18th of July, 1994. And almost in concert, immediately, there was a massive campaign by the United States and Israel jointly to allege that Iran and Hezbollah had perpetrated the massacre. And the first question one would ask is, why would they be interested in bombing a Jewish community center in Argentina? It does make very little sense. But the truth has finally come out. In an August 1994 cable, and I think this is WikiLeaks, US Ambassador James Cheek boasted of a steady campaign the embassy had waged that kept the Iranians in the dock where they belong. In 2007, Cheek admitted that, to my knowledge, there was never any real evidence of Iranian involvement. Bill Brentsit, chief of the political section of the US Embassy from 1994 to 1997, acknowledged in an interview a decade later that the suggestions of Iranian responsibility were based solely on a, quote, wall of assumptions, and that there was no, quote, hard evidence. So who did it? Well, in 2014, a former police spy, Jose Alberto Perez, who had infiltrated the Jewish community in Buenos Aires and the center on behalf of Argentine's federal police, revealed to two investigative journalists, Miriam Lewin and Horatio Lutz, he'd been ordered to turn over blueprints of the Amir building to his federal police case officer. And as it was reported in La Prensa on the 28th of November 1994, the SIDE unit, that's the intelligence agency handling the Amir investigation, was notorious for its hatred of Jews. The group consisted of veterans of the Dirty War, known as the Cabildo Group. There is a magazine, and there has been a long-standing magazine called Cabildo of the far right, which is anti-Semitic, which was allowed to thrive and prosper under the junta. So, as I say, I've given this talk on the case of Argentina because I think it's illustrative and representative of the fact that when or if a genuinely anti-Semitic regime comes to power, the idea that Israel will step into the breach is really nothing more than a delusion. What Israel will do is when there is a crisis, like in Ethiopia, a famine, it will pluck out Jews in order to bolster the number of settlers it has. And it does that regularly. But in terms of defending the rights of Jews in the diaspora, Israel is not interested. And therefore, you can contrast what actually happened in Argentina, a very, very real example of anti-Semitism, with the entirely fake anti-Semitism campaign that we've witnessed in this country. I've probably gone on far too long now, so I will stop and take questions from people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was as interesting as I think all of us expected. Comrades, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand, and then I'll bring you in. I was going to ask you something, Tony, which was something about your number when you were talking. It's a small thing. When you're talking about 85% of Jews in Britain considered Jeremy Corbyn poses an existential threat. I would dispute that number in the sense of, you know, how you make these polls and how they're put together. I mean, how do you get hold of Jewish people? You probably go to the Board of Deputies or something and ask for contacts, etc. So I would have thought that's quite a twisted analysis or a twisted poll. Also, do you think, I mean, is there some issue perhaps around the Jews being murdered in Argentina, that it's sort of the wrong kind of Jew? You know, were they amongst the socialists, the leftists, etc.? Would that have played a role for the Israeli regime, that it's not that those kind of Jews who would probably come to Israel, and it's therefore we probably don't have to get out of our way to rescue them? Or is that just totally barking up the wrong tree? Do you want me to bring in some people now, or do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, on the question of the percentage of Jews, what did I say? 84% was it? I can't remember now myself.
85, I think it was, yeah.
What was it?
85, I think.
85, was it? Right, yes. It's a figure I saw in a report. How they arrive at that figure, I simply don't know. I mean, there are standard methods of polling. We know how polling can sometimes get it very wrong in terms of elections. But I think it's fair to say that after being bombarded for 4 years by the Jewish Chronicle and every other Zionist paper, that the majority of Jews in this country bought into it to a large extent. I mean, that's an unfortunate fact, but I mean, you know, it's accepted that something like 69% of Jews in this country voted for the Conservatives. They're no longer working class, the majority of Jews. They're upper middle class. I mean, the historian Walter Rubenstein said it's probably the first ethnic group in history not to have a working class of any sizable nature. So they are on the right, and they are susceptible to this nonsense. So I have no doubt. I mean, the campaign against anti-Semitism produced, I think it was a totally bogus poll, but they produced a poll saying 45% of Jews, this was early in the campaign, believed that conditions in Britain were approaching that of the 1930s. And a correspondent in Haaretz a mainstream correspondent, a Zionist, who writes, Anshel Peffer, he writes a column in the Jewish Chronicle, said, well, if they really believe that, it shows an utter disconnect from reality. I mean, I've used a shorthand and saying they're just stupid, utterly stupid, if they believe their situation was in any way comparable. Well, I mean, the reality is that whereas you had a militant Jewish working class in the 30s, you simply don't have that now. So of course their politics have changed. As for the wrong type of Jews, of course, Argentinian Jewry as a whole, where I think something like 5% voted in the Zionist elections, there were very few paid up Zionists, would have been treated as a lost cause in many ways by Israel. But I think the principle remains that even if there had been a large and sizable Jewish community there, Israel would have given precedence to its own interests and its anti-communist alliances over their interests. I don't think it would have made any substantial difference, because the argument from the Zionist point of view is quite simple. They had the opportunity to emigrate to Israel and become settler colonials just like that. They refused. They can't complain now what is happening to them. I mean, that's the logic of Zionism. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Garda, please. Hi, welcome to the show.
I can't hear Garda.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, first of all, look, I want to pay tribute to Tony, who I admire very much for his fearless, long-term efforts in telling the truth about this subject, which is, we know, hedged about with taboos and so on. And so thank you, Tony. And I really mean it from the bottom of my heart. Now, the point I wanted to raise is I wanted to know what you thought about actually what Israel is for. You see, quite obviously, it does not come to the aid, as you've shown so well, it does not come to the aid of some Jews, but it does come to the aid of others. So it's acting according to some kind of strategy. And I'm wondering if you'd like to say a little bit about that. And one of the reasons I'm saying this is very much on my mind, is that the behavior of the Zionist movement during the Mandate years is a very instructive expose of what these people were about. From what I conclude, actually, they were obsessed by the idea of setting up this Hebrew state, and the Jews were fodder that had to come in and stuff it, really. I mean, stuff the state so that it becomes a proper state. They had no interest otherwise, not that I could see, in the welfare of Jews, despite the propaganda. I don't want to talk too much about this because I'm reading currently a book which I also want to plug by Tom Suarez called Palestine Hijacked. And the very detailed account of how the Zionists behaved under the British Mandate, I think, is really important to expose. So I'd be interested in Tony's views.
Thank you, Garda. Tony, do you want to reply straight away?
I'm quite happy to, yeah. Thank you very much, Garda, for your kind words. I appreciate them. And I know Tom Suarez, and he's an excellent author. The Zionists did their absolute best to stop him speaking when he brought out his last book, The State of Terror. And I think this book is now his successor book. And he's a very meticulous historian indeed. And what he's producing is extremely invaluable. Because I think the history of the Mandate period has barely been covered to date. I mean, there are lots of, if you like, bourgeois historian accounts, which really just skim the surface. But there is really very little detailed analysis of what actually the Zionists did. And in fact, I think the best description from official reports is the Hope Simpson report in 1930, issued in the wake of the 1929 riots, which was very simple in detailing what the causes were, namely the perpetual alienation of Arab land from the indigenous peasants who'd been evicted from it. But to go back to your question, what is Israel's purpose? Well, it's certainly not as a refuge from anti-Semitism. Israel is not, as that useless, bankrupt organization called the AWL once stated, a life-raft state. It's anything from it, anything but it. In 1923, the Zionists, Chaim Weizmann in particular, lobbied the British government not to allow refugees from the Ukrainian pogroms to enter Palestine because they were the wrong sort of Jews. They didn't want refugees, weak-minded, disabled, ill, and so on. They wanted young pioneers. So the question remains, what is Zionism's purpose? And I think that's quite clear from the quotes. And if you can give me just a second, I will bring it up. It's a famous quote from Ben Gurion, but please let me say, well, my search mechanism on my computer has a look for it. I say this was a very famous quote. It was, you may remember, after Kristallnacht, the Nazi pogrom in November 1938, when over 100 Jews were killed, when virtually every German synagogue was burnt to the ground, and when the world finally woke up to the fact that Jews of Germany were in dire danger of their lives, Britain agreed at last to a rescue plan by the border deputies and others, whereby 10,000 Jewish children were remitted to Britain, not accompanied by their parents, I note, but nonetheless, it was a token. And Pamela Shatkis, who's written an article subsequently, commented that if the border deputies had been captured in 1938 by the Zionists and not 1940, those Jewish children would probably become one more grisly statistic, because under Selig Brodetsky in 1940, the first Zionists elected to the presidency, they displayed absolutely no interest in saving any Jewish refugee. But Ben Gurion said, it was a meeting of Vad Leumi, which was the Zionist parliament, on the 2nd of December 1938. Ben Gurion made a speech, in fact, it was to Mapai, the Israeli Party's Central Committee, on the 9th of December, stating, "If I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. We must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel." This is a well-known quote. It's in the official biography of Ben Gurion. There's absolutely no doubt that it's genuine. Tuvia Freiling, a notorious apologist and archivist at the Ben Gurion University, tried to explain it away, but he never denied that Ben Gurion had said it. And that quote says the history of the people of Israel. In other words, Israel was seen, the Zionist, the Jewish state was seen as a means of perpetuating the Jewish people race forever. In other words, without a Jewish state, the Jewish people would simply disappear, they would assimilate, they would mingle with non-Jews, and eventually there would be no more Jews, or there'd be a tiny minority dotted around the globe. But by forming a state, they would perpetuate the Jewish nation race indefinitely. And that really is what it's about. And that explains everything about the rise of the Zionist far right, the religious Zionism, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and all the rest of them. They are open Jewish supremacists. They are open Jewish racial nationalists. But I have to say, There's nothing much that they stand for that Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres and Ben Gurion didn't stand for, but they were more diplomatic about it. They didn't openly boast about what they did. They tried to hide and cover it up, whereas Gavir believes in honesty. He's an honest, if you like, Jewish supremacist rather than a dishonest one. But that is the goal of Zionism and always has been. It's a perpetuation of the Jewish people race. And to the Zionists, the Jews were a race. They weren't a religious people. That's a fundamental tenet of Zionism. The Jews are not a religious people. I mean, they claim the Jews form a nation, which is absurd because, I mean, if you're a member of the same nation, then you speak the same language, you occupy the same territory. Jews are all over the world, scattered from India, China, to Argentina, Brazil, etc. So in essence, they're talking about race, and the early Zionists did talk about race. So it's a racial project. That you have to understand Zionism in those terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Gada, for joining us. Richard Purdy, please.
Thanks, Tina. A number of points. First of all, although I think the contributors who tried to pull Tony up for mischaracterizing the Pinochet regime as a fascist regime were correct, but I think that was a complete side issue. And it did not damage Tony's case at all. The next point I want to make is really to say that his, if you like, test case, a comparison of the experience of Jews in the Soviet Union with the experience of Jews in the post-Pinochet dictatorship in Argentina was compelling and highly instructive. And I think he made that case extremely well. And he used it to illustrate, again, compellingly, the politics of Zionism. Where I was disappointed a little bit, because of the way in which the meeting and his book reference the Holocaust, is because I was looking forward to a scholarly exposition of the way in which, in fact, the leaders of world Zionism collaborated with the Hitler regime post-Kristallnacht, with a view solely to ensuring or employing the ethnic cleansing by the Hitler regime of Jews as a convenience for establishing the so-called Jewish homeland. Fourthly, I think that Tony was absolutely correct in identifying with Herzog, the founder of the Zionist movement, utter pessimism about the possibility of ever overcoming anti-Semitic feeling towards Jewish people. And I think the crucial thing that we have to take from this as socialists is to understand, and I don't think Tony's mentioned it, the circumstances in which, in situations of heightened class struggle, working class struggle, anti-Semitism has been overcome. And the prime example of this, I think, in both Poland and Germany, is the Jewish Bund, where the divisions between Jewish and non-Jewish workers were completely overcome in their common class struggle against capitalist exploitation. So this really, that kind of experience, the experience of the Jewish Bund, of Jewish working class leaders like Luxemburg and Liebknecht, is the key to understanding the bankruptcy of Zionist politics. I think that's mainly what I wanted to say, except of course that in geopolitical terms, we have to understand that the support for the state of Israel by Western imperialists, our own homegrown ones here, and in the States, is absolutely key to promoting Western imperialists and oil interests in the control of the whole Middle East. That's about it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. Tony, do you want to say anything?
No, I'll take a few more.
Okay. Matthew, I think, should come in, who's disagreeing with your definition on fascism.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for the lecture. It was very useful, as usual. And I look forward to your book. I'll need to order it from you. So, yeah, it should keep me entertained. I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing really is to say that the thing about the current situation in Israel, of course, is that it represents imperialism, particularly in the Middle East. And it's to say, I think there's a certain issue in terms of people not seeing which end of the leash is where. The business end of the leash is in Washington. You know, the control is in Washington, and you know, this is it represents that element of imperialism, and clearly, obviously, the British ruling class with extensive, you know, both as in terms of its alliance with the Americans, close alliance with the Americans, and also, of course, its extensive interest in the Middle East, of course, is extremely wedded to Israel and the Israeli regime. And the thing about what happened with Corbyn, of course, is it was quite clear that behind all that anti-Semitism nonsense was the ruling class itself, which is why Corbyn was so craven in front of it, because it wasn't a case of a few people or a few Zionists. It was actually the ruling class. And as a reformist, of course, they're the people he's beholden to. And so this is why he took and McDonnell and others took that attitude to what was done to them. I think the second thing, as people said, is in terms of the characterization of fascism. I mean, I disagree that the junta in Argentina, horrible as it was fascist. I mean, it was a military regime. You know, it originated in the military, obviously clearly backed by the CIA and all schooled in the usual techniques in the School of the Americas in Georgia, I think it is. You know, the whole, you know, the usual American method in Latin America, but fascism is quite a different political formation. I mean, it involves essentially the petty bourgeoisie. It's a street movement, you know, and in many ways is actually, you know, against the ruling class itself, and is a last card. As I said, you know, it's a kind of desperation by the ruling class, which is not to say that they were, you know, obviously they will use it, but it has quite a different character. You know, in terms of its base of support, its methods, its organisation, you know, its suppression of the working class, you know, to a military regime, which obviously is Bonapartist and relies on comes out of the machine of the state. So, and the methods used in terms of the, you know, the left to fight these things is and should be different. And unfortunately, of course, the left was hopeless in terms of fighting, has been hopeless in terms of fighting military regimes in Latin America, and in fact, of course, has promoted strategies which have got people killed rather than actually been had success in many cases. But I do think, under the current circumstances in which, you know, clearly the ruling class is now openly preparing to use fascists in various areas, including in the US itself. And you can see this in terms of the split in the Republican Party. There is now an open consideration of using these forces, that we need to be very, very careful in terms of how do we define fascists and how, you know, precisely, and the tactics used to oppose them. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Tony, do you want to reply?
I mean, I'll take one more if there are people with their hands up.
Ian wants to come in. I think your camera still doesn't work, so we can't see you.
Sadly. Thanks. And thanks, Tony, for the great presentation. I don't know if it'll be taken the wrong way if I say you seem as well as normal, but do get well soon. And I like the different angle you've taken on it today, because I was preparing to tune in to the topic as advertised, so to speak, but I've heard you speak very well on it before. But I think for a number of reasons, the most obvious being the one that you said, since it was 30 years after the establishment of Israel, it was a test case for the AWL's ridiculous, and others more significant than them, the ridiculous idea of a life raft state, ridiculous in the context of a group that should know better, that was supposedly on the Corbyn left. But enough about them, because the other reason that it was particularly interesting to me is that this struggle continues in Argentina today. Tony touched on it, with the junta were later jailed by a left-wing pink-tied government in the early 2000s. Hector Timmerman, you did mention, was the foreign minister and part of that government. I think a bit later than you said the 90s, I think it was the early 2010s, late noughties. But anyway, he unfortunately died a couple of years ago with a witch hunt still hanging over him around this AMIA case, because you've broken it down very well. The Murky bombings and the likely perpetrators and the interests in pushing the investigation in another direction. But it's now got entangled with Latin American right-wing lawfare politics, where just last month, Christina Kirchner, the president who Hector Timmerman served under, was banned from electoral politics on the eve of announcing her presidential run as the anti-IMF, anti-neoliberal left candidate for president next year. Not actually over the AMIA case, it was over another one, but there was a whole barrage of cases against her, one of which was AMIA, accused her of treason to the fatherland for trying to investigate the case properly, rather than subordinating it effectively, rather than subordinating it to Netanyahu's then crusade, which later on worked with Trump, but at that time crusade against Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. So it was very murky indeed, but it was really the stuff that we talk about a lot with the Middle East, and the stuff that we often talk about too with Latin America coming together in terms of international politics, and these struggles that we sometimes think of as separate coming together. And although AMIA may have receded for now, in terms of the witch hunt against Kirchner, sadly too late for Timmerman himself, I think this is still something that we have to fight back against. We saw what happened with the witch hunt against Lula a few years ago. He's now the comeback kid at 78. But when he was knocked out of the last election, but won, it led to the rise of Bolsonaro. And they're clearly trying to do the same thing in Argentina now. And we should be alert and have an international campaign the way we did around Lula to try and stop it. And just one last point on Christina Kirchner. There was an attempted assassination against her a couple of months ago, just before this verdict came out, but in the witch hunt atmosphere it produced. And the guy who tried to shoot her, thankfully the gun jammed. Now there's all sorts of conspiracy theories from the right that it was a put-up job, but there's no evidence for that at all. But he actually had Nazi insignia tattooed on him, but some of the reporting of it cropped that out, just showed his face rather than his chest with the tattoos, because inconveniently for yet more narratives, those are the same insignia that are on some of the regimental insignia in the Ukraine, in some of the groups that we're supporting out there. So yeah, I think basically, if Tony's got anything to say about that, that'd be great. I think we should have an international campaign like we did around Brazil, around Argentina, because the lawfare and witch hunt continues. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Tony, there's quite a few more comrades with their hands up. I don't know if you want to say anything in between.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take the last three.
Okay.
Richard first, you referred to Pinochet, but of course Pinochet was in Chile. He was first general of Videla, and then I think it was in 1981 he was succeeded by General Viola, and then Galtieri at the end of it. But no matter. Matthew, a couple of points really. Talking about the leash on Israel and that control is in Washington. I think that's a bit simplistic. Israel is not simply the instrument of the United States. It also, as a settler colonial state, has its own interests, as did other settler colonial states, Rhodesia, South Africa, etc. They're certainly not anti-imperialist, but there are divisions within the imperialists. And Israel, if you like, is on the far right of the imperialists. So, I mean, there are differences, but of course, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, despite the fact that the US is clearly the establishment not happy with Ben Gvir and the far-right religious Zionism group, they will go along with them rather than support the Palestinians. I mean, there is nothing really Israel can do while announcing a policy that they're going to kill all the Palestinian firstborn that would shake them from that. And I'm not even sure that if they adopted the latter position, the United States wouldn't find some excuse or other. So, no, I mean, Israel is, if you like, on the far right of international politics, and is forming its own alliances with states like Saudi Arabia, for example. As for the question of fascism, I never said that Argentina under the junta, or for that matter, Chile under Pinochet, were fascist states. Although I think people should be aware, if those of you remember the coup in Chile in 1973, it was preceded by a middle-class revolt, the banging of pots by the middle-class women in the suburbs and so on. So there was if you like, a mobilization by the petty bourgeois, by the middle class and so on. So it had a social base, the regime that came. But I have no doubt that, I mean, the individuals, whether it was in Chile or in Argentina, can be properly described as fascists. And I think Trump actually can be described as a fascist. Doesn't mean his regime was a fascist regime. I think we have to distinguish. Individuals can be fascists. Collectively, they can be fascists. And I think that is a proper description of the Argentinian junta. Ideologically, I mean, that was where they were at. As regards Ian's point, you know more about Christina Kirchner than me. I am aware of the attacks on Christina Kirchner. There was a whole issue over the prosecutor who committed suicide in the case and whose office was basically infiltrated by the side intelligence unit and so on. I mean, yes, of course. I mean, for the far right in Argentina, they've adopted the bombing and many other things as a weapon against the left. And Christina Kirchner has been the symbol of that fight. And she's a very brave woman. She was a previous president. And the only way they can prevent her winning again is to stop her standing. This is what the right does, and how the Argentinian working class responds and the oppressed of Argentina will be indicative as to whether they accept that or they simply refuse to accept the legitimacy of any elections which bring to power another, an Argentinian Bolsonaro. But we know that capitalism, when its back is against the wall, is anti-democratic, and certainly in the countries dominated by imperialism. So there is a real fight in the whole of Latin America, especially Argentina and Brazil today, because Lula's position is by no means secure. And we know what's been happening. I think, is it Ecuador or Bolivia? I can't remember, where Peru, where the president has been arrested in a coup, supported by his own vice president. So it's a pretty tense situation all round, but the left is fighting back, I think. But Ian, you know more about the campaign against Christine Kirchner, and I agree with you. We should give it every support.
Thank you, Tony. Next speaker is Cheryl, please.
Oh, hi, Tony. Thank you so much for speaking when you're not feeling well. A couple of questions. The whole concept of Jews as not as a religious group, but as a racial group, when did that come about? Because it's something that I still isn't very clear in my head. And the second question is, when I was reading something, the other day about how far right the current Israeli government is, it made me feel very pessimistic about the future of the Palestinians. Why do you think there's been a move towards the right in Israel? That's kind of slightly off point, but yeah, those are the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Shall I bring somebody else in?
Yeah.
Okay, Sabi, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thanks to Tony for a very interesting, very absorbing presentation with a lot to think about. My question is a broad historical question. That if you look at Jewish history, there's an argument that Israel, Zionism, is actually alien to the Jewish historical tradition. Jews were traders traveling all over the Middle East and Europe. There's a strong argument driven by a lot of recent research, which asserts that even at the time of the Roman conquest in 70 of the Common Era, a majority of Jews were living outside ancient Israel because they were travelers, traders, selling their wares. So over the centuries, and I obviously can't go into detail here, Jews developed an international outlook. And if you look at the 20th century, if you look at the Russian Revolution, look at the experience of the labor movements in Europe, North America, South Africa, Jews played a role in setting up communist parties, social democratic parties, trade unions. So in Zionism, Israel is completely alien, completely opposed to that tradition. It is not something, Jews, nationalism is only something that a majority of Jews subscribe to after the Holocaust. Even I think in Poland, as late as 1938, there was a council in an area of Warsaw where a majority of the Jews voted for the anti-Zionist party. I can't remember all the detail. Anyway, I just thought Tony might like to respond to that. And once again, many thanks. I've got your book here and I look forward to reading it. So many thanks for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Sabi. Robert is the final speaker, though we have time if anybody else wants to come in.
Thanks, Dina. And hi, Tony. Hope to have you over here in Ireland in the not too distant future. The situation, I'm a campaigner, so I'm not in any way addressing this issue as in any way academic or otherwise. I find your book absolutely motivating. So far, I haven't finished it. And the detail and scholarship there is just fantastic. Thanks so much for that. Looking at the situation from a campaigning point of view, because I know you're also a campaigner above all, I'd like to have your thoughts on something, because looking at it from the current situation in the UK, you've got both parties unusually pro-Zionist, certainly pretty near anti-Palestinian, if you like. And here in Ireland, we have a pro-Palestinian, on the face of it, situation with our politicians, our foreign affairs and so on, and government generally, and the people south of the border, for sure, are very much aligned with the Palestinian cause. and see, as your book even exemplifies, many crossover examples of comparability with our experience under the British imperialist situation and the search for freedom and so on. So we identify with Palestinians. Given the new situation, new government in US, a Republican Party in chaos, and a Democratic Party which is just following the status quo. We have the two parties in the UK, irrelevant in terms of any progress and supportive of the existing status quo in the regime of the Zionist regime. And we have a new, even more far-right regime in Israel than we have ever seen. How do you see campaigners finding a way into that? How do they dip their fingers in, apart from in any way just for the sake of blowing off steam and feeling good about ourselves? But how do we actually begin to affect change in terms of public opinion with the media against us and everything apparently against us? You can understand how difficult it is to maintain the motivation to see justice done and to get a movement. Like I was in the anti-apartheid movement, and the motivation was so real, and the progress was gradual but evident. We are stuck now in a situation where there is no progress, there is only downhill, and it is so demoralizing for campaigners like myself. And I would love to hear just your thoughts on the way forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert. Tony, can I ask you a question, actually, which is something from your article? If it's too far out, tell me to go away and we talk about it some other time. But the sentence really sprung out to me is that the Holocaust represented the defeat of the left and anti-fascism in Europe, the failure of the communist parties in Eastern Europe to confront anti-Semitism in Poland and in Czechoslovakia. They actually stimulated it, led to Zionism being an attractive solution. Now, this is that's a really interesting subject. I know you're not feeling too well. If you don't feel up for discussing that, don't. But I thought that's a very interesting, half sentence that you don't explore more in your article, but probably you do it in the book. And of course, there's now a couple more people with their hands up. Do you want to reply to a few things, or do you want to hear the others?
I'll reply, I think, now. Otherwise, I'll lose track of everybody. Cheryl, and to a certain extent, Robert, your question was, why do you think that there's been a move to the Israeli far right? The question I would ask is, what do you mean by Israeli left and right? Because really, it's always been seen in terms of the Zionist left and right. Those who support a peace process that would go nowhere, and those who are honest and clear. The left Zionists were hypocrites. They talked about a Jewish democratic state. Well, as Ahmed Tibi, the Arab member of the Joint List, once said, Israel is Jewish for Arabs and it's democratic for Jews. Because, if it's a Jewish state, then it means at the end of the day, whatever the majorities are, Jews will hold sway. And furthermore, politics is ethnicized. So you're having Jews pitted against Palestinians. And the nature and structure of the state is it can never be a state of its own citizens. So in a sense, the Labour Zionists were utter hypocrites. Whereas the far right, whatever else you can say about them, they have the virtues of honesty and candor. They say exactly what they mean. Death to the Arabs, and may their villages burn, and various other slogans. I mean, the Labour Zionists won't talk like that, but did they do any differently? I was reading an article yesterday about the village of Birim, a Christian village, which voluntarily, at the request of the army, left. It was told that they only need to leave for a few days in 1948, and then they would be allowed back. They weren't. The Supreme Court, when they were petitioned, instructed the authorities to allow the Palestinians, this was, I think, in the Western Galilee, to allow the villagers back, the village of Ikrit and Birim. The Israeli state and the Israeli army simply refused to implement it, which just goes to show that Israel itself is not a state based on law. Indeed, instead, what happened was a platoon of Israeli soldiers turned up one day at the local police station, asked to be accommodated. Their mission was to blow up every single building bar the Christian church itself. So, I mean, destruction of Arab villages, no one has destroyed more than the Labour Zionists. So, when the moderates, inverted commas, say that they would, in the words of Yair Lapid, that his ideal is maximum Jews and minimum Palestinians. Well, Ben Gvir has a solution to that, which is to expel the Palestinians. Have done with all these soft liberal cliches, saying one thing to the West and another thing to your own electorate. Ben Gvir says it to everybody, and Smotrich does. They say that, Jewish women shouldn't have to share maternity wards with Arabs. They say that every single bit of Israel, Greater Israel, i.e. Palestine, is Jewish. The Labour Zionists believe that, they just don't say it. So, given the choice between voting for honest racist and dishonest racist, the choice has been taken. Of course, it's very embarrassing for Israel's representatives in Washington and our own board of deputies, which refuses to say a thing. And I have proposed to JVL and other groups there should be a Jewish demonstration outside the board of deputies to ask where their voice is now about racism. But let's see what happens. Sabi, yes, I agree to you. Zionism is wholly alien to the tradition, to the Jewish tradition, which, there were traders, they were specialist artisans, they were intermediaries. One shouldn't whitewash and paint in golden image views in a golden light the role of the Jewish diaspora at certain times in Poland. They could quite legitimately be said to be the oppressors of the peasants. They were the tax stewards. They collected the taxes. I was told that they would stand outside the church and anyone who owed them money wouldn't be admitted. They were given power by the nobles and the kings. So, they played different roles. But the idea that Jews in what's called the diaspora would emigrate to Palestine because this had been a 2,000-year-old dream, it's just illiterate nonsense, totally absurd. For 2,000 years, there were no barriers to Jews returning to Palestine, returning inverted commas, if they so wished. But why would they? There was no reason to. They had left quite voluntarily. There was no need to return. And in fact, between 1850 and the First World War, when 2.5 million or so Russian and Polish Jews emigrated because of the pogroms, because of economic hardships and so on, where did they go? 99% went to the United States, Britain, or other parts of Western Europe. Whenever Jews have been given the choice, the last place they wanted to go was Palestine. And the more honest Zionists, like A.B. Yehoshua, always admitted to it. Now, in Poland, you refer, well, in Poland, the Zionists did have a base in the early 1920s, there's no doubt. In fact, in 1919, Polish Pole Zion split between a left and a right. And the left Pole Zion, which is far and away the stronger, could probably be described as a non-Zionist party. It didn't accept the primacy of Palestine. It refused to join the World Zionist Organization, which it termed the bourgeois organization. And it worked together with the Bund, the Committee of 30 I mentioned in my book, when the Bund headquarters was bombed by the Polish fascists, the Endeks. They formed a Committee of 30, made up of 10 members of Left Pole Zion, 10 members of the Bund, and 10 members of the Polish Socialist Party. They gained entrance pretending they were workmen and bombed the fascists. So, I mean, there is no doubt, I mean, as to the role of the Zionists, but during the 30s and 20s and 30s, the Zionists lost support in Poland because the dream of Palestine really made no sense when you were suffering anti-Semitism. And Poland was an extremely anti-Semitic society, especially in the country. I mean, the working class were largely immune to that. And in 1938, the last 3 elections in Poland, local council elections, the Bund and the Polish Socialist Party formed an alliance. And everywhere, in every major city, that alliance won. The Zionists were virtually nowhere to be seen. In Lodz, the second biggest city in Poland, they won 61% of the Jewish vote. In Warsaw, it was even greater. There were 20 Jewish council seats, and 17 of those were won by the Bund and just 1 by the Zionists. Literally, I mean, the Zionists had nothing to say about the conditions of Polish Jewry. And so most of their base simply disappeared. And to be quite honest, many of the left Zionists in Hashem Hatzer and the Chalitzim in Dror and so on just faded away. They refused the instructions of their political movements in Palestine to evacuate during the Holocaust, and said the fight is here, not in Palestine. But that's another history, if you like. But certainly Zionism is alien. It's a narrow, nationalist, backward movement, which really has nothing to offer except further misery and conflict. And we're seeing that today. As to Robert, I'd say this, that you shouldn't despair. Socialists shouldn't despair, however bleak things are at times. I think the battle for public opinion has been won. The point is that our elites do not conduct their foreign policy on the basis of public opinion. They conduct it on the basis of their own political and economic interests. And that is as much true today as it ever was. And support for Israel is fading amongst the general population. Oh, we saw that in Qatar, for God's sake. I mean, with British fans shouting Free Palestine. We saw in Qatar, incidentally, that the Abraham Accords, which the Arab regimes had conducted with Israel, were extremely unpopular with the Arab street. And Israeli journalists who went there got a rough reception by all accounts. So I don't think so. As for Tina's question, the Holocaust undoubtedly represented the defeat of anti-fascism and the left. I mean, it can't be described in any other terms. The rise of Hitler itself, the crazy decision of the German communists to adopt the third position whereby the Social Democrats were social fascists, and to actually say after Hitler, us, you know, it was utter madness. And the attempt of the Communist Party leadership to stifle the Red Front and the activists and the groups who were tackling the fascists on the streets. I mean, all of that was shameful. And the role of the Stalinists, the Stalinist leadership in the Soviet Union beggars belief. After the war, my understanding, it is my understanding, is the Polish and the Czech Stalinists played along with that. I mean, Czechoslovakia, you had the Slansky trials, which was basically a scapegoating of Jews who were allegedly traitors and so on. In Poland, I mean, there was complicity of the Polish Communist Party in the Kielce pogrom, the largest pogrom that stimulated mass emigration of the returning Polish Jews. So, I mean, Stalinism has a lot to answer for in terms of its attitude and its policies regarding anti-Semitism. I'm not by any means an expert in there, but the Soviet Union continually played down the fact that Jews were the main targets of the Holocaust because it wasn't convenient to their narrative that everyone was persecuted equally, when it was quite clearly not true. And that also meant playing down the collaboration of Russian and others in Ukraine as a result. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. Sean wants to come in, and then on Garda for the second time.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. I really just came in to pay tribute to you and the wonderful work you do. Like you've kind of educated me over the years. Like I read your blog and your constant utterings on there. Like, and your book is quite magnificent. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And one thing that, going from the main subject of the his Zionism not being concerned about the diaspora Jews. Well, Zionism, the bit that I liked about your book, which I actually haven't come across or haven't read about recently, and I've got many books on the subject of fascism and the Holocaust, etc. But the whole, the part that anti-fascist Jews fighting fascism in Germany, Poland, and Austria, and they had to fight the Zionists as well. Like the Zionists were as big an enemy of them, just like Cable Street here. I thought you make that point very well. I think that's some more needs to be. Maybe there's a lot written about it, but I've missed it in my readings. Like, you know, but that's the first time I've ever read in great detail about the Jewish anti-fascist attempts, like during the Holocaust or before the Holocaust. Thanks very much, Tony, for everything.
Thank you, Sean. That was nice. Garda, please.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks again, Tony, for all that you've been talking about and your work and the book. But I really wanted to end on a note from a Palestinian perspective. You know, it's easy to forget that these intricacies of the history of Zionism, anti-Semitism in Europe, all the stuff that we talk about over on this side of the world are not ones that really engage Palestinians. For Palestinians, it's very difficult for them to understand this whole history. And I'm not referring to people like me. I mean, of course, there are many educated Palestinians, people who've lived in the West who do understand. But in general, the bulk of Palestinians, and certainly the people amongst whom the Zionists first operated, were in no position to understand any of this stuff, to understand European history, to understand the intricacies of Jewish persecution, the details of the kind of things we've been talking about. But I just thought it was good to remind ourselves that for Palestinians, in a way, it doesn't really matter if the enemy has this long history of whatever it is and the problems that have beset that enemy historically and the color of the politics of that enemy, etc. In the end, I think it's good to remember that for Palestinians, this is an enemy. No matter what it calls itself, what its angsts are, is not relevant to Palestinians. For them, this is an oppressive, brutal occupier, oppressor that they want to get rid of. I just thought it might be good for us to just remember that there is that point of view amongst, of course, the victims of Zionism and all the stuff that Tony has been talking about.
Thank you, Garda. For us, it's important, though, because we need to understand why we are opposing what they're doing. Cheryl asked in the chat, Tony.
I know, I saw.
I've seen it. Okay. And there's one more person who wants to come in.
Could Cheryl just reiterate what her other question was, because I've forgotten?
The difference between a race and religious group of the Jews when.
Oh, yeah. Yes, yes.
Okay, there's one more person I can't quite see. Could you start your video, please? Type right. That's all I can see. Hold on. Type right. There you are. Sorry.
And I typed in a question. It's something that I found 2 weeks ago, that Israel has now instituted a cash bond system for visiting the West Bank. It's $25,000 US to $50,000 for permission to get into the West Bank, fully refundable after you leave and at the discretion of Israel. Have any of you heard of this?
Okay, Tony, do you remember Cheryl's question, or shall we bring it back?
Yeah, she's just you reiterated it. The difference between the racial and religious group. In other words, how do you define the Jews, in essence? Well, the only way, I mean, I've discussed this with Moshe Machava, whose opinion is, and it should always be considered carefully, that you can't define Jews internationally as anything other than a religious group. There is no other bond between them. Of course, it's problematic in a sense because many people who aren't religious nonetheless identify as Jews on one or other basis, not least because their mother was Jewish. But nonetheless, I mean, that is the only basis, I think, that you can define Jews. But for Zionism really opposed to this whole idea that Jews could be defined by religion, because for them it was a political question. And they were aiming to create a new Jewish nation race in Palestine. So for them, it was a racial question. Race is primary, class is secondary, wrote Moses Hess, the first political Zionist in Roman Jerusalem, a small pamphlet in 1861. And Max Norder, the deputy to Theodor Herzl at the First Zionist Congress, said there was nothing more. I agree with Messer Edward Drummond, who was the leader of the anti-Dreyfusards, that the Jewish question is a racial question. And for the Zionists, it was always a question of race, not to religion. It didn't matter whether you were religious or not. The early Zionists were open about the fact they were atheists. Theodor Herzl's first child, his first son, Hans, wasn't even circumcised, which, you know, is the basic right for anyone who considers themselves Jewish. So for them, it wasn't religious. It was a racial question. The reason was quite simply that anti-Semitism in the feudal era took a religious form. Christ killers and so on, poisoners of wells and so on. But you know, once a Jew converted, that was it. I mean, they weren't interested, if you like, in exterminating Jews because they were a race. But for the Nazis, Jews, their religion was immaterial. Although they use religion to define them racially, because there is no such thing as race. But for the Nazis, it didn't matter whether you converted. I mean, that was seen as simply a means to escape being caught polluting the Aryan race. Once a Jew, always a Jew. And so you had the concept of Christian Jews. Jews who were Christian by faith, but Jewish by race. So for the Zionists, being Jewish is a racial definition, and the law return in Israel basically mirrors the Nuremberg law definition, which goes back to 1870, which is based on the practice of the religion. If your grandparents practiced the Jewish religion, then you were Jewish. It depends what number. If there were only two of your grandparents, then you were a first degree Mishlinger. If it was only one grandparent, you were a second degree, which did mean in practice that you'd probably not be sent to an extermination camp. So I hope I've cleared that up.
Cheryl is actually here. Could she just quickly come?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That was really helpful. Some years ago, when I was in both Palestine, the occupied territories, and Israel proper, in Israel proper, I stayed with an Iraqi Jewish family, and their experiences are that there's quite a hierarchy amongst the Jews in the Israeli state in terms of racism, because their experience, I just wanted to, say that their experience is one of where they were treated, they were Arab Jews. And there seemed to be quite a lot of racial discrimination within the Jewish community, and the ones who were the more wealthy American seems to be Jews, and white Jews were kind of considered higher up the hierarchy than, well, that was just my anecdotal, the experiences that family were sort of telling me about.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. I mean, within the Israeli Jewish community, there is a racial hierarchy. I mean, the first Zionist under Arthur Rupin really did not accept that the Oriental Jews or the Mizrahi Jews were even really Jewish. I mean, Arthur Rupin, who was probably the second most important figure in Zionism before the establishment of the state, brought over thousands of Yemenite Jews. He believed that European Jews were non-Semitic, whereas Arab Jews were Semitic. And he called them dysgenic. He didn't like them. He considered them inferior. And they were paid starvation wages and were virtually deprived of all medical help. And thousands of Yemenite Jews, 50% nearly of those brought over to do the hard work for the kibbutzim, I should add, died. As simple as that. I mean, it was pathological stereotyping, as I quote in my book, a PhD thesis by Etan Bloom, which is well worth reading, incidentally. It's on Arthur Rupin, who was a key figure in Zionism. But yes, I mean, one of the factors, which I didn't mention in the decline of Labour Zionism, was they were absolutely racist towards the Arab Jews. They brought them over. I mean, in Iraq, it's a whole story. They simulated anti-Semitism by planting bombs in synagogues and Jewish cafes and so on to create the appearance of anti-Semitism, to stimulate the emigration that Israel needed. It needed a working class. And the Iraqi Jews, which is an extremely prosperous community, had no inclination to come to Israel, but they were stampeded. There was a secret agreement between the Israeli government, Ben Gurion and Nouri Said, the Iraqi British ruler who was overthrown in 1958. So yes, I mean, when these Iraqis and other Middle East Arab Jews arrived in Israel, they came off the planes, and the first thing that happened was they were showered with DDT, pesticide. I mean, they were considered unclean. They were kept in encampments. I mean, they had an extremely miserable existence, which is one reason why in 1977, Begin's Likud achieved the victory that it did. That was the revolt of the Mizrahi. Unfortunately, the Mizrahi Jews did not solidarize with the Palestinians. On the contrary, they became extreme right-wing nationalists in many ways, and they became the bulk, if you like, of the support of the right, and that's as true today as it was ever. But I mean, there was a small movement of Black Panthers which did make those connections, but it was a very small movement. On Ty Bright's observation about a $25,000 deposit, I have absolutely not heard of that, I have to say. A deposit has been demanded for Ukrainian immigrants coming in, and their treatment has been pretty abysmal. Basically, any Ukrainian immigrant or refugee who's not Jewish is basically, it's made very clear to them they're not welcome because they're not Jewish. As regards Garda, here I do have to disagree with you. I think you do have to understand your enemy. And that does mean understanding Zionism. For example, if the leadership of the Palestinians in 1993 had understood the nature of Zionism, that Zionism would never agree voluntarily to hand over a portion of the land of Israel to the Palestinians for a state or whatever you call it, then surely their decisions would have been different. It was the illusions that Zionism was capable of making peace with the Palestinians which led to the Oslo Accords. And in my view, the Oslo Accords were the most disastrous things to happen to the Palestinians since the Nakba itself. It was an absolute tragedy. It's created a quivering regime in Ramallah, which does the dirty work for Israel, which is the military subcontractor for Israel. So I think it's actually very important to understand Zionism, where it comes from, and also what motivates it and what its real purpose is. The idea that Zionism, any wing of Zionism, would compromise its fundamental values, which is the whole of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, I think is delusionary. And the whole concept of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is a biblical concept. It's very malleable. The full extent of it is up to the Litani River in Lebanon, across to the Euphrates in Iraq, and down to the Brook of the Nile in Egypt. So, I mean, Israel has actually got a long way to go yet before it can say it has secure borders. Thank you.
Thanks. There is one more person who wants to come in, and that's Paul. I think there's something wrong with your camera, isn't there, Paul?
Yeah, I've turned it off. Hello, Tony.
Hi, Paul.
I enjoyed that, and I will email you for a copy of your book. Yeah, there were two things. One point I wanted to make, and the second one, I've got a question I want to ask, but I'm not expecting you to answer on this one because it might be quite a big one. So basically, I've come across a term recently of there being two types of Zionism. One, it was described as political Zionism, and the other was cultural Zionism. And I just wondered if you could briefly explain the difference, or do you accept that there's a difference for that matter? Because I don't know about it. I thought Zionism was Zionism, but I didn't know that there was that distinction being made by some groups of people. And another thing I was going to just a comment really that I came across when I heard about the ultra-Orthodox Jewish group called Netori Carter. One of their members, I don't know the name, but one of their members once said that if you're an Orthodox Jew, the most unsafe place to be in the world is Israel. And I thought that was interesting because obviously your book makes clear, obviously, and also from your talk, that the state of Israel had nothing to do with being Jewish. So I thought I might throw that quote in there from an ultra-Orthodox Jew who actually says that about Israel. Okay, thanks.
Okay, before I come back on Paul's question, there was just something I wanted to mention in regard to Cheryl about the oppression of the Mizrahi Jews. when the Yemenite Jews came in the early 50s, thousands of their babies were stolen in Israeli hospitals and by Zionist agents. It's a scandal that's persisted right up to this day. They were either given to American Jews to adopt, or Western Ashkenazi Jews in Israel to adopt, etc. And the parents were told they died or some other mishap had happened. And I say this is a scandal, and you can Google it quite easily. You don't need to take my view, because they were considered backward as savages, really. I mean, there was a consistent program of de-Arabization of the Arab Jews, because that was seen as something Oriental, and Israel is of the Occident. I'm sorry. Can I just go and get a glass of water?
Okay, comrade. Yeah, I think we'll bring this meeting to a close very soon.
Yeah, I'll just get myself a glass.
Yeah. Thank you for powering through, Tony. Problem is you're too interesting and everybody has questions and wants to ask you something else.
Right, that's a bit better, sorry. Political Zionism encompassed the vast majority of the Zionist movement. The cultural Zionists, who've died out completely, represented a splinter. Their main figure was someone called Echad Ha'am, a very significant figure for what he said in The Truth from the Middle East. He wrote in 1891 about how the Jewish colonists were behaving exactly as any other non-Jewish oppressor of the Jews, the violence and contempt they had for the Arabs. He was one of the founders of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He died in 1927. He was a cultured and learned man. I mean, another man who was associated with it was Judah Magnus, who was basically driven out. He was the first president of the Hebrew University. This was a splinter, an absolute fragment of the Zionist movement. It believed that Israel could be a light unto the nations. Well, we know how that turned out. Yes, they represented, if you like, an attempt to introduce civilization into the Zionist movement, the Enlightenment, if you like, but Zionism was founded on a rejection of the Enlightenment. That is the sad reality. They had illusions that you could compromise, that Zionism could compromise with historic Enlightenment values. Remember, I mean, Zionism was founded on a rejection of Jewish emancipation. It represented the most backward and reactionary strand in Jewish history. I mean, that is why the Labour writers adopted it. That's why in 1920-21, Powell Zion affiliated to the Labour Party. I mean, it didn't represent the majority of Jews then or now. Well, maybe now, but it certainly didn't then. But it was a settler colonial movement. So, I mean, people like Ramsay MacDonald took it to their heart, as it were. But in the cultural Zionists now, there is no such strand, to be quite honest. It was at one point had a certain presence, but it had no influence. Thank you.
Okay, that was the last question. Thank you so much, Tony. You're powering through it, getting a bit the energy levels going down at the end there. But thank you very much for coming along despite your poor health. I thought that was a lot of insight into the junta, which not many of us probably were aware, and the reluctance of the Israeli state to get involved and you know, help Jewish people who were under attack. So thank you very much for joining us, comrades. There's almost 100 people in the meeting, which shows how interesting that issue still is and has become, of course, in the last few years. We have 2 more sessions in our series, Live of the Left. Next week, we'll be looking at John McLean and then Eric Fromm. So hope to see comrades there. From January 26th, we're participating in a new series called Why Marx. Details up on our website soon, and you can get involved with that. It's not run by the LLA exclusively, but we are part of that group, and that should be an interesting series. Thank you very much, Tony. Hope you get better soon. Have a rest now, go to bed. Thanks, comrades, for joining us. See you soon. Good night.